1 minute late. The boss steals 15 minutes of my pay. So I sat down, told him, no pay, no work. What happened next started a revolution on our job site.
My name's Jake Thompson, and I've been swinging hammers and earning my keep in construction for 15 years now. What I'm fixing to tell you happened about 4 years back, and it's a tale that proves sometimes one man standing up for what's right can change everything for a whole crew of hard-working folks. I was working this construction job where we'd start at 6 in the morning sharp. Ain't nothing unusual about that in our line of work. Most days, the crew would roll up around 5:50 or so, grab some coffee, shoot the breeze for a few minutes, and get our tools sorted before the real work commenced. It was a good arrangement, professional-like, and we all understood the rhythm of it. But our boss, well, he was a peculiar sort of fellow when it came to punctuality. This man would preach about being on time like he was delivering Sunday sermon, waving his arms around and carrying on about respect and professionalism if any of us working folks happened to show up at 6:02 or 6:03. Meanwhile, that same boss would saunter in at 6:05, 6:07, sometimes near 6:10, acting like he owned the sunrise itself, and we should all be grateful just to witness his arrival. The hypocrisy was thicker than molasses in January, I tell you what. Here he was lecturing us about punctuality while showing up late more consistently than any one of us ever did. But we all needed the work, so we bit our tongues and kept our opinions to ourselves, figuring it wasn't worth stirring up trouble over a few minutes here and there. That arrangement worked fine for months, even if it did stick in our craws somewhat. We'd all learned to live with his double standards, knowing that bosses sometimes get to play by different rules than the rest of us. But then came that Tuesday morning in October when everything changed, and I accidentally became the spark that lit a fire under the whole crew. I pulled into the job site that morning right on schedule, same as always. The air had that crisp bite that tells you winter's knocking at the door, and there was frost on all the windshields that made everything sparkle like diamonds in the early light. I was feeling good about the day ahead, ready to get in there and do my part to keep the project moving forward. But wouldn't you know it, I'd gone and left my tape measure sitting right there on the passenger seat of my pickup truck. Now, any carpenter worth his salt knows that a tape measure ain't just a tool. It's like your right hand. Can't frame a wall, can't cut lumber, can't do much anything without knowing your measurements. So I had to hustle my way back across that job site, weaving between material piles and equipment to fetch that essential piece of gear. By the time I grabbed my tape measure and quick-stepped it back to where the crew was gathering, the clock on the office wall read 6:01. Just 1 minute past our start time, but you'd have thought I'd missed half the day the way the boss reacted. He was standing there like a judge at the pearly gates, checking his watch with the intensity of a man timing a horse race. His face had that look that meant trouble was coming, and I could see him getting all worked up over what amounted to 60 seconds. "Well, well," he said, drawing out each word like he was saving 'em for special occasions. "Look who decided to grace us with his presence. See that clock? Says 6:01. We start at 6. That makes you late." Now, I'd heard this song and dance before from him, usually delivered to whichever poor soul had the misfortune of arriving a minute or two behind schedule. Most times, we'd just nod and get on with our work, knowing that arguing with the boss rarely leads anywhere good. But this particular morning, he had apparently decided to escalate things beyond his usual complaining. "Matter of fact," he continued, his voice taking on that tone that meant he thought he was about to teach us all a valuable lesson, "I'm tired of this sloppy behavior. Yesterday I told everyone that if you ain't standing in front of me at 6 sharp when we start, then I'm docking 15 minutes from your time for the day." The silence that followed was heavy as a wet blanket. Every man in that room knew this was different from his usual griping. This was him drawing a line in the sand and daring us to cross it. The unfairness of it hit everyone at once. 15 minutes docked for being 1 minute late from a man who showed up late more often than any of us. I meant what I said yesterday, and I'm serious about it today, he went on, seemingly enjoying the uncomfortable silence he'd created. Time is money, and my time is valuable. Y'all need to learn that there's consequences for not respecting other people's schedules. Then he looked directly at me, and I could see satisfaction in his eyes as he delivered what he thought was his knockout punch. Since you're late today, I'm docking you 15 minutes. Maybe that'll teach you to respect other people's time and show up when you're supposed to. Something inside me snapped like a dry twig. Not because of the money. 15 minutes pay wasn't going to make or break me. It was the principle of the whole thing. The sheer unmitigated gall of this man who treated punctuality like a rule for everyone except himself. Here he was, docking my pay for being 1 minute late when he'd been late more times in the past month than I'd been late all year. But what really got my blood boiling was the injustice of it all. 15 minutes pay for 60 seconds late? That wasn't discipline. That was just petty tyranny dressed up as management. And I'll be damned if I was going to stand there and take it without saying my piece. I looked at that boss for a long moment, letting the weight of what he'd just said settle in. Then, without saying a word, I started unloading my tools right there on the spot. I set down my hammer, my drill, my level, and my nail bags, making each movement deliberate and slow so everyone could see exactly what I was doing. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop on the carpet. After I'd set down all my gear, I walked over to a 5-gallon bucket that was sitting nearby, turned it upside down, and planted myself on it like I was settling in for a long stay. I crossed my arms, leaned back comfortable-like, and looked the boss dead in the eye. The man's jaw dropped like a drawbridge, and his face went through more color changes than a sunset. "What on the Sam Hill do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice rising like steam from a kettle. "Well, boss," I said, keeping my voice calm and steady as a pond on a windless day, "it's simple as arithmetic. You just told me you're docking 15 minutes from my pay 'cause I was 1 minute late. That means I'm not getting paid until 6:15. And I'll tell you what, I enjoy what I do for a living, but I don't do it for free." The look on his face was worth the price of admission to a county fair. He started sputtering and carrying on like a wet cat, waving his arms around and talking about insubordination and disrespect and how I couldn't just sit there and refuse to work. "You can't just refuse to do your job," he hollered, his face now red as a fire engine. "I'm telling you to get up and get to work right now." That's when I delivered the line that would echo through that job site for weeks to come. "If you're telling me to work without paying me, then that's against the law, boss. You really want to open the company and yourself up to that kind of risk. Maybe I'm the kind of Sue, maybe I'm not, but if you keep on telling me to work after you docked my time, then we're going to find out one way or the other." The room went quiet as a graveyard at midnight. Every man there knew I had him dead to rights. Labor laws are clearer than mountain spring water on this subject. You can't make someone work without paying them, and you sure can't threaten their job for refusing to work for free. The boss knew it too, even if his pride didn't want to admit it. He tried to salvage some dignity by stomping around and muttering under his breath about attitudes and respect, but his authority had leaked out of him like air from a punctured tire. He couldn't argue with the law, and he couldn't fire me for refusing to work without pay. He was trapped tighter than a tick on a hound dog, and everybody in that room knew it. So I sat on that bucket for exactly 15 minutes, watching the clock like a hawk watches a hen house. The boss tried to maintain his composure, but you could see him getting more frustrated by the minute. The rest of the crew was trying to look busy, but I could feel their eyes on me, and I could see some of them starting to smile. At 6:15 sharp, I stood up, dusted off my pants, picked up my tools, and got to work like nothing had happened. But something had changed in that room, something you could feel in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. The other fellas were looking at me different, and more importantly, they were looking at the boss different too. Word of what happened spread through that job site faster than gossip at a church social. By lunchtime, every man on the crew knew the story, and by quitting time, they were all talking about it. I could see the wheels turning in their heads, and I had a feeling that my little act of defiance was going to have consequences beyond just that one morning. Sure enough, the very next day, the revolution began in earnest. One of the guys, let's call him Eddie, sent the boss a text message that was polite but firm. "Hey, sorry boss, would have been there at 6:02 and gotten docked, so I'll see you at 6:15 and I'll get to work then." True to his word, Eddie sat in his truck until 6:15, then walked in and started his day when his paid time began. The boss tried to argue with him about it, but Eddie just shrugged and said he wasn't about to lose 15 minutes pay for being a minute late. The day after that, another guy followed suit, sending a similar message and waiting in his vehicle until 6:15 to start work. Within a week, it had become a regular occurrence. Anytime someone was going to be even a minute late, they'd just text the boss and let him know they'd be starting at 6:15 instead. The boss was beside himself with frustration, but he couldn't do anything about it. His own policy had created this situation, and now he was losing way more productivity than he'd ever lost from people being a minute or two late. Instead of losing 1 or 2 minutes per person occasionally, he was now losing 15 minutes from multiple workers almost daily. But the real damage wasn't just the lost time. It was what happened to the morale and spirit of the crew. Before his little power play, we'd all been willing to show up a few minutes early, help get things organized, and start the day with a positive attitude. Now, nobody wanted to risk being a minute late and losing 15 minutes pay, so they'd either arrive right at 6 o'clock or wait until 6:15 if they were running behind. The easy camaraderie that had made our crew special started crackling like old paint in the sun. Men who used to joke around and help each other get ready for the day became focused on clock watching and protecting themselves from the boss's arbitrary penalties. The teamwork that had made tough jobs manageable started breaking down, replaced by every man looking out for himself first. Project deadlines that had been easy to meet suddenly became tight squeezes. The 15-minute delays were compounding daily, and the lack of early morning preparation time meant we were starting each day behind the 8 ball. Tools weren't organized, materials weren't ready, and the smooth flow of work that had been our trademark became choppy as rough water. Every morning became a reminder of the boss's failed policy. Every text message from a worker was a slap in the face of his authority. Every man sitting in the parking lot until 6:15 was proof that his intimidation tactics had backfired worse than a mule's kick.
The boss tried various approaches to regain control. Sometimes he'd threaten, sometimes he'd try to cajole, and sometimes he'd even offer small incentives to get people to show up early. But once trust is broken, it's harder to fix than a shattered mirror. The crew did their jobs professionally, but the willing cooperation and easy respect he'd once enjoyed were gone like smoke in the wind. Meanwhile, I found myself in a peculiar position. The other guys looked up to me as someone who'd stood up to unfair treatment, but I also knew I'd painted a target on my back.
The boss couldn't fire me for what I'd done. It was perfectly legal. But he could sure make my life difficult in a dozen small ways. Work assignments became more challenging, schedules got shuffled to my disadvantage, and every minor mistake was magnified and documented. I knew my days were numbered, but I also knew I'd done the right thing. Sometimes standing up for principle comes with a price, and I was prepared to pay it. The situation continued for nearly 3 weeks, with productivity dropping and morale sinking lower each day. The boss was clearly frustrated, but his pride wouldn't let him admit his policy was a failure. He kept doubling down, insisting that discipline and respect for time were more important than the obvious problems his rule was causing. Then came the day of reckoning, swift and sure as a summer storm. The boss's supervisor made one of his surprise visits to check on how the project was progressing. This upper management fella had been in construction for decades and could spot problems from a mile away. What he saw that morning was a job site running behind schedule, with multiple workers sitting in their vehicles while the clock ticked toward 6:15. He watched the controlled chaos of people finally starting their day 15 minutes late, observed the tension between supervisor and crew, and quickly figured out what was going on. The conversation between the boss and his supervisor happened in the office trailer, but those walls might as well have been made of tissue paper. We could hear voices rising, words like productivity and leadership and what were you thinking drifting across the job site like autumn leaves in the wind. When the boss emerged from that trailer, he looked like a man who'd been through a tornado. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by the deflated posture of someone who'd just been dressed down by their superior. The supervisor followed him out, looked around at the situation, and addressed the crew directly. "All right, boys," he said, his voice carrying the authority of experience and genuine leadership. "Let's get back to basics here. You show up ready to work at 6 o'clock, and you get paid from 6 o'clock. A minute here or there ain't worth all this foolishness. We're here to build things, not play games with people's paychecks." The relief that washed over that job site was like cool rain after a long drought. You could see the tension easing out of everyone's shoulders, and smiles started appearing on faces that had been grim for weeks. Within a few days, we were back to our old rhythm, arriving a few minutes early, organizing for the day, and working together like the professional crew we'd always been. But the boss's troubles weren't over. Word of the incident spread through the company faster than wildfire through dry grass. Other supervisors heard about the policy that backfired, the productivity losses, and how his crew had essentially rebelled against his leadership. He became something of a cautionary tale, a living example of how not to manage people. His attempts to reassert authority fell flatter than pancakes. The crew was polite and professional, but the easy respect was gone forever. Every order was followed correctly, but without enthusiasm. Every interaction was civil, but cold. He'd learned the hard way that respect can't be demanded. It has to be earned and maintained through fair, consistent treatment. As for me, well, I knew I was living on borrowed time from that moment forward. The boss couldn't fire me for standing up for legal rights, but he sure could make my working life miserable in ways that were hard to prove or document. Every day became a careful balance between doing my job well and watching my back. The end came about 2 months later, though it wasn't entirely the boss's doing. My mama, bless her heart, took a bad fall at her house and hurt her hip something fierce. At her age, she needed someone to look after her during the day while she recovered, and being her son, that responsibility fell to me. I called in for 3 days straight, explaining the situation and keeping the boss informed about my mama's condition. Any decent person would have understood that family comes first, especially when it's your elderly mother who needs care. But the boss saw an opportunity in my absence. When I returned to work, expecting to get back to my regular duties, he was waiting with termination papers and a list of reasons why my excessive absences and unreliable attendance made me unsuitable for continued employment. He documented everything carefully, making sure his revenge was legally sound, even if it was morally questionable. "Sorry," he said, though his tone suggested he was about as sorry as a fox in a henhouse, "but we need people we can count on to be here every day. Family emergencies are understandable, but the work has to get done." I looked at that man and felt something like pity. He'd gotten his revenge, but at what cost? He'd lost the respect of his crew, damaged his reputation with his superiors, and shown everyone his true character. Meanwhile, I was leaving with my principles intact and my head held high. The crew gathered around as I packed up my tools, shaking hands and exchanging contact information. They all knew what had really happened, and they all respected me for standing up when it mattered. That meant more to me than any job ever could. As I drove away from that job site for the last time, I reflected on what had happened and what it meant. Sometimes doing the right thing costs you in the short term, but compromising your principles costs you even more in the long run. I'd rather be unemployed with my dignity than employed without it. The story didn't end there, though. Word travels fast in the construction industry, and my reputation as someone who'd stand up to unfair treatment actually helped me find better work. Within a month, I was working for a company that treated its employees fairly and understood that mutual respect is the foundation of good business. As for that boss, well, his story took a different path. The incident became a company legend, and his ability to manage people was permanently questioned. Sometimes justice comes slowly, but it comes as sure as sunrise. The lesson in all this is simple but powerful. When working folks stand together and refuse to accept unfair treatment, they can change things for the better. It doesn't take a union or a lawyer. Sometimes it just takes one person willing to sit on a bucket and say, "I won't work for free," and others willing to follow that example. That's worker solidarity in action. Regular people looking out for each other and refusing to let power-hungry supervisors take advantage of their willingness to work hard. It's as American as apple pie, and it still works when people have the courage to stand up for what's right.
If you enjoyed this story, please give it a like, subscribe for more, and share it with someone who'd appreciate it. Thanks for watching.